So let me then begin. So yesterday we saw that even though we can reinterpret the string amplitudes as some of our Feynman diagrams, so there is some peculiar feature, namely that we have to add new vertices at every loop order. At every loop order, we have to add new vertices of arbitrary order, right? 1 point function, 2 point function, and so on. At this stage, this looks ad hoc, okay, because you are just adding it because you want to reproduce a certain amplitude. But in fact, once we try to understand this from the perspective of a gauge invariant string field theory, these are just Feynman diagrams. Right? So we will see later that these Feynman diagrams can be derived first from a field theory, which will be the gauge fixed version, and then we will show that that field theory can be thought of as gauge fixing of a gauge invariant field theory. And there we will see that adding these vertices is essential for gauge invariance of the theory. Okay, unless you adjust the vertices precisely in the way we have been doing, the gauge invariance of the theory will be lost. Okay, so in a sense, you can aptly justify what you are doing by saying that we want a gauge invariant theory. Okay, but at this stage, it's just an ad hoc prescription because all we have said so far is that we know what the amplitude should be, but the initial amplitude should be at least. It should include integration over the whole section. And you are just trying to see how to build that out of Feynman diagrams.
So if we fix the gauge, then these diagrams will not appear.
No, these diagrams will appear, but the fact that you have to add higher point vertices, okay, is essential for gauge invariance of the theory. Okay? Without adding this higher point vertices, you will find that the theory loses its gauge invariance. Okay, so there is a formalism called Backel formalism which automatically achieves this. Okay, now there are two other features that we have to discuss, which is slightly different from what happens in conventional field theory.
I have a question.
Yes.
Last. So you showed this ST and U channel, these portions which see like in generic cases they will not fill up the whole section.
That's right.
But when like if in a situation when like there is a overlap in the sense.
Yeah, S and P channel diagrams cover the same region.
Yeah. So for one single point in the base, I can have two.
Exactly.
So, will that signal some kind of?
No, we have to just subtract off that contribution. See, there is an overlap. Right? So that's why I said it doesn't have to be strictly sections. Right? We are integrating over some subspace of PGN, right? PGN and here is NGN. Suppose the S channel diagram covers this part and P channel diagram covers this part, right? So there are, on this point there are more than one points. But what you can do is that you just complete this subspace. Here it's not a straight section because here it cuts it 3 times. So this will be part of the 4-point function. And integration over this whole thing will give you the correct result. Okay? Because effectively here we are integrating but in the opposite orientation, right? So this is basically a subtracting of this contribution.
Is it natural to expect that one could, in principle, make the things that you're getting for the 3-point thing smaller and smaller so that they don't overlap?
Yes. I mean, that is this lambda, that if you take S naught to be large,
yes, so then
right,
they will all become
then, yeah, because then the only region that you are covering is near the degeneration.
So,
right? The S channel diagram will cover, for example, when 1 and 2 vertices are close to each other. P channel diagram will be when 1 and 3 are close to each other, and U channel will be when 1 and 4 are close to each other, and then there will be an overlap. Right? So you can always ensure that this doesn't happen. But all I am trying to emphasize is that even if this happens, right, even if you don't ensure it, and it happens, it's not that you have to throw away this formalism altogether, you have to basically subtract it off. Right? The important point is that whether you are adding or subtracting, this region does not include degeneration. Right? Because you don't want infinities in the vertices. Right? Because vertices are actually defined as the integral over the moduli space. Right? The infinities which came from the boundary of the moduli space, that we have isolated as in terms of field theory. Right? And they are, if there are divergences, it will be exactly of the kind you encountered in quantum field theory, and one should be able to deal with it as you will with it in quantum field theory. Okay. So the second feature that I was mentioning, okay, which is a little peculiar for loop amplitudes, okay, is the following. When you have three points, when you had three amplitude, right? You take 3 points on the sphere, say 3 points on the sphere, and you glue them. Okay, you identify. And essentially we represented this by having a complete set of states propagating in this, and that we interpreted as the Feynman propagator. But all of these states carry definite Gauss number. Okay, they carry definite Gauss number because by Gauss charge conservation, see these are external vortices, their Gauss charges are fixed. And once you fix the Gauss charge of this Gauss charge, the Gauss number of these vortices of quadrant is automatically fixed by the conservation laws. Same is true on this side. Okay, so the states, even though a priori has sum over all possible states of the CFT, only states of a given Gauss number will contribute. Okay, and it is easy to check that for physical amplitudes, if external states are all carrying Gauss number 2, then these vortex and these vortex will also carry Gauss number 2. Okay, and this you can repeat for higher power functions as well. Okay. So only the Gauss number 2 states, okay, appear in the intermediate stage. Those phi n and phi m all have Gauss number 2 for 3 amplitudes. But this is not so for loops. Okay. Let's take the example of a 3-point function. We started with the 3-point function on the sphere, and then we glued these, okay, which is equivalent to a handle. Now you see that Gauss charge of this is fixed. Okay. So the sum of the Gauss charges of these two are fixed, but the Gauss charges of individual states are not fixed, and only the sum is fixed. Okay. Which physically means that the states which are propagating, okay, the sum over states that you have to include, will run over states of all possible Gauss number. Okay, states of all possible Gauss number propagate as intermediate state in this propagator. Is this point clear?
Almost same like the momentum.
Well, momentum I am coming to that will be the third topic. Right now it's Gauss number, yes. So it's on the same footing as a momentum, right? Just say the momentum of this is fixed by that of the external states, but momentum of this is not fixed by that of the external states. Right? So you have to sum over, integrate over momentum. So in the same spirit, you have to sum over Gauss numbers.
We can glue two more punctures in the above case.
Here,
Yeah.
these, that will be a loop.
No, not. One of this and another of this.
That will also be a loop,
Yeah.
right?
So in that case,
In that case, okay, let's see. If you glue, so what happens is that if you glue this with this, then what you can do is you can, only the sum of the two Gauss numbers is fixed, right? So you can now allow this to have arbitrary Gauss number and compensate by this. And the same thing happens on the other side, right? So again, states of arbitrary Gauss number start propagating in the loop. Is that clear?
The second gluing is just like adding a handle on the larger thing that I've.
Yeah. So it is very similar to what is here, right? Adding a handle, and so what you are saying, Mrityunjay is saying that, it looked like that this Gauss number was fixed and this Gauss number is fixed, but once you add a loop here, this Gauss number is not fixed anymore, right? Because only the sum of the two will be fixed. Okay? Only if this was an external state that the added Gauss numbers will be fixed. Okay? Now states have different Gauss number, okay, than what was there for physical states, means that you have to somehow add more fields when you do loops, right? If the physical fields correspond to states of Gauss number 2 only, okay, now we have states of arbitrary Gauss number. Okay? So in the Feynman propagator, okay, we are summing over many more fields than what was there before. So this may look a little strange, okay, but this is actually something we also see in field theory. We see in field theory when you start with gauge theory and gauge fix. Okay? And you know that when you gauge fix, you have to introduce ghosts. Okay? And those ghosts don't appear in the tree level, but they propagate in the loop. Okay? And here again, it looks ad hoc that we have to allow for propagation of states of arbitrary Gauss number. Okay? But when one starts with gauge invariant strength field theory and gauge fixes, one finds that this gauge fixing gives rise to ghosts, and those ghosts are precisely all the extra states that are now propagating in the loop. Okay? Okay, so this again has a natural explanation from the point of view of strength field theory. Okay, even though it looks ad hoc here, that once you go to loops, you have to increase the number of fields that you use for the propagator. Is this okay? Okay, and finally, let me say something about a momentum integral. So the fact that there is momentum integral is clear. Okay, the same argument. But momentum is no longer fixed here. You can put a momentum vortex operator momentum k here and minus k here. Total momentum will be constant. Okay, or k here and whatever is necessary here. So in the loop, you will have to integrate over momentum. Okay, which is not very surprising. In field theory also you have to do it. Right? In tree diagrams, all the internal propagators carry fixed momentum, which are fixed by the external states. But once you go to loops, you have to start integrating on momentum. So you have integral dvk. You can put the 2 part to d. This d I am not fixing right now because d depends on the number of non-compact dimensions. Right? The string theory may have total central charge k0 26, but the number of non-compact dimensions over which the momentum integral runs can be different from 26 or 10. And then there is some integrand, okay, which of course is for the case of 3-point function, then it's is this 3-point vortex, right? And the propagator, raised to the propagator. Now in conventional field theory, you have to worry about whether this is a divergent integral or not. Right? From the k goes to infinity region, that can be ultraviolet divergence. In string theory, for diagrams like this, that issue is not problematic because of the fact that these vortices, as we have seen, okay, have a suppression factor exponential minus s naught times L naught plus L naught. Yeah, s naught by 2. Every vortex, if you have started with an s naught, okay, then you absorb this e to the minus s naught by 2 times L naught plus L naught or factor into the 2 vortices on the other side. Okay. Equivalently, you just choose your local coordinates by scaling e to the minus s naught. In whatever way you see it, okay, the vortices have a suppression factor of this kind. Okay. And L naught plus L naught bar has of the form k square by 2 plus cm. So as k square goes to infinity, there is exponential suppression from the vortices, from the integral. Okay, so you don't have to worry about ultraviolet divergence in these integrals.
So as you saw this exponential behavior, even though S naught is arbitrary, we can just scale our local coordinates to.
Yeah, but if you scale your local coordinates, what is happening is that in the vortex, you have to make a transformation, right?
Yes, that is
What is there is an f prime of 0 to the power h, right? F prime of 0 bar to the power h bar. Okay. So the small factor, the suppression factors will not come from here, right? Because f prime of 0, if you scale the coordinate by say lambda, you will some lambda to the power h, right? Lambda bar to the power h bar. If lambda is a small number, right? It's exactly like this. H and h bar are the L0 and L0 bar eigenvalues, right? Okay. So if I identify lambda as e to the minus s naught by 2, okay, this is exactly that. So you can either think of it explicitly as it started in the integral from s naught to infinity and then you absorb this e to the minus s naught by 2 factors, or you can think of this because you have scaled the vortices by small numbers, okay, you have suppression factor from there. Okay. And these are, I mean, in a sense, in the conformal field theory, you can see this as suppression factor coming from operator expansion. That when two vortex operators come close, okay, then when you expand, the higher the dimension of the operator, the more suppressed is the coefficient. Okay, and that's the suppression factor you are seeing here. Okay, but this is in this sense more general, okay? Because this appears not only when you talk about two operators coming together, okay? But any time you build the amplitude by doing proper diagrams, okay? You always have this equally minus s star by 2 factor. Okay, this is your choice. You can always make the vertex look like this. Okay.
I'm going to feel if there is some tachyon, right? Is k square plus this factor in tachyon k square is.
Well, the point is k square is a variable. So the fact that there is a tachyon will be in the coefficient Cn. That's a fixed number. It is true. It will be to the minus s naught times some negative number here. That's a fixed number. Right?
This k square runs over all that.
Yeah, k is the internal loop momentum, right? Which you are integrating over. Okay. So the point is that this will have a suppression factor of the form e to the exponential minus s naught by 2 k square by 2. Okay, and then there are other factors. Okay, other factors which also guarantee that the contribution from the intermediate states of very large mass, right? The large Cn corresponds to large mass square, right? That those are also suppressed because of this suppression factor. Okay, so only relatively light fields and relatively low momentum regions contribute. However, there is a caveat, and the caveat is that this k square is minus k naught square plus k square. Okay. So the argument that we gave is good for this, but it's bad for this. Okay? It has the wrong sign. If you think of the internal loop momentum as the Lorentzian momentum as we normally think, then this in fact diverges as k naught goes to infinity. Okay. So this means that we cannot think of the integration of the internal loop momentum as a integration of a Lorentzian momentum. Okay. So in conventional quantum field theory, you think of this as integration over Lorentzian momentum. K naught integral runs over dl axis, k vector runs over dl axis, and then you use appropriate I epsilon prescription to move the poles in the appropriate region. Right. Here, the only way we can make sense of this is to think of the internal loop momentum integral as Euclidean integral. Okay, so you have to think of k0 integral a0 to run from minus I infinity to I infinity.
This perception is in field theory also.
Yeah, but in field theory, you can rotate, right, and make the k0 integral lie along the real axis, right, without and as long as you keep the epsilon correctly. Okay, so that you cannot do here. Okay, you have to take the k0 integral from I infinity to I infinity.
Always have to be along the imaginary.
No, so that's the point, not along the imaginary axis. Okay, we'll see why. Okay, 8 points have to be from minus I infinity to plus I infinity. Okay, to ensure convergence. In the middle,
It doesn't.
you don't know. I mean, we have not said so far, right? Now I'll say how to fix what it does in the middle. Okay, and we will see that if you keep taking it along the imaginary axis, you'll make a mistake. Because eventually you are interested in external momentum which is Lorentzian. Right? The internal momentum integration we can fix. We can define how you want to integrate. But the external momentum Lorentzian momentum. Okay? And as you will see that causes a potential complication. Okay, I illustrate this way. Find my diagram. So let's take simple one loop diagram. Okay, so suppose we have momentum coming in from this side, P1, P2. This will be say P minus K, P is P1 plus P2. This is K, and here goes P3. So the relevant part of the loop momentum integral will be dvk. D 1 over minus and Vortex factors. Okay, and what we are saying is the Vortex factors have the property that if we take the K0 integral to run from minus infinity to I infinity, then the integral is manifestly convergent from infinity, right? There are no UV divergences you have to worry about. Okay, as long as the K0 integral runs from minus infinity to infinity, I infinity, right? Because what about the numerator factors, right? There may be a lot of numerator factors, etc. But the Vortex factor has the exponential suppression which basically kills all divergences. But you cannot take the K0 integral on the real axis, right? Because then the Vortex factor in fact will exponentially diverge. So what we can do is to do what we normally do in a quantum field theory. Suppose we are interested in P, which is whose zero component is Z and the spatial component will be not vector.
So what is that P minus plus?
Pardon? P minus P. P minus. It is I just expanded out the denominator as spatial part and the zero part. Okay. So let's suppose that P, the zero component is Z and the spatial component is P. Okay. This is the actual Lorentzian momentum that we are interested in. So this is the atom. Okay. But what you can do is to take P. We take P to be of the form lambda E. Where lambda is some complex number in but normally what is done is it's been taken to the first quadrant. Okay, so if you put the complex things, lambda is something like that. And the conventional field theory prescription is that you take start from lambda equal to I, okay, or somewhere on the imaginary axis, okay, and then analytically continue lambda to the real axis. Okay, that's how we define the conventional amplitudes. Okay, the analytic continuation procedure from Euclidean to Minkowski amplitudes is done this way. Right? You take the energies to be lambda times real numbers, and then you take lambda from the imaginary axis to real axis, but you go like this. Okay, negative energies are continued this way. Okay, and conventionally what to do is that as you are doing this, okay, so when the momentum was along the imaginary, when P0 was imaginary, you could have taken the K0 integrals along the imaginary axis. Okay, because then everything is particularly non-singular. Okay, this should have been I times something, this should be I times something, so this is positive, so it will be a particularly non-singular integral. That's the Euclidean result. And then analytically continue P0 like this. Okay, and conventionally in field theory what you would do is that you will also take the K0 contour and start rotating. Okay, and you will eventually come here. Okay, and by the fact that you have analytically continued along this direction and this direction leads to the I epsilon prescription. Okay, that's the origin of the I epsilon prescription, that you start from Euclidean result and then analytically continue. Now what you cannot do here is that as you take P0 from here to here, you cannot rotate the K0 contour. Because if you try to rotate the K0 contour, right, you are going in a region where the integral diverges exponentially. Okay? So you cannot rotate the K0 contour. But at the same time, you cannot allow a pole to pass through the contour because then that's not analytic continuation, right? You are changing the result. Okay? If you analytically continue, you have to make sure that you never cross a pole. Okay? So what you have to do is that you keep the ends fixed. Okay? But in the middle, you have to deform the contour so as to not cross a pole. Okay, that will be the way you have to define the momentum integral in a strength field theory. Okay, or the integration over the K0 in a strength field theory. You have to deform the contour in the middle so as to not cross the pole.
So if we deform the contour in the middle somewhere, we can do it in such a manner that there is no pole inside this contour and this only integration.
But it's not enough that there is a pole inside this contour, because our definition is that you have to start from this line, right, when P0 is imaginary, and then as you take P0 along this, okay, there should be no pole ever crossing the contour. Right? That's the meaning of analytic continuation. Right? So in that process, you have to deform this contour. We'll see the example. This example, it's not possible to keep the contour like this, typically. Okay, so let's see this in this example. So where are the poles? The poles here are at K0 equal to plus minus square root of K square plus M square, and K0 is equal to P0 plus minus square root of P minus K square plus M square. Right, that's why the K0, I am looking at the K0 integral. The K integral you can take to be on the real axis, there is no confusion there, right? So it's the K0 integral which you have worried about. So K0 has poles here. So we start from P0 equal to I. Okay, then in that case the poles are very well separated. So there are one pair of poles like this. Okay, so this is minus square root of K square plus M square. This is square root of K square plus M square. And then there is a, if P0 is purely imaginary, then there are, say, some pair of poles here. Right? If P0 is I times C, right, then this is just shifting this up, so this is this in our list. Maybe I should just put some color on this. Okay, this is green and this is red.
Sorry, why are you taking P0 imaginary?
Because that's the starting point. We start by defining the Euclidean result and then analytically continue. I am using this picture that I take P0 to be I and then the actual amplitude will be analytic continuation but in this direction.
For the external particles, you are already analytically continuing for external momentum.
No, external momentum I am taking to be imaginary, purely imaginary to begin with.
So, I see, so already Euclidean.
Yeah,
External
already Euclidean. Now from there we will start. That will be our starting point, Euclidean Green's function. Right? And then the Lorentzian Green's function will be defined by analytic continuation of Euclidean Green's function. Right? That's the idea. So we begin by starting with Euclidean Green's function.
Right? Only for external particles, for the external momentum.
Yeah, external momentum are Euclidean, and in that case, the internal momentum integral can be taken to be purely Euclidean. There is a confusion. On these two sides and these two poles kept on these two sides.
Okay, so you are starting for Euclidean theory.
Yeah,
Right.
this is Euclidean, right? Now we will see what the analytic continuation means. What you have to do to the moment to integration over K0. Okay, going to do this analytic continuation.
So yeah, so sorry, this initially also the K0 K0 integral was not running along the real axis. You're
No.
not trying to
Exactly.
start from purely Euclidean where
Yeah.
you've started with
Everything is Euclidean. External moment are Euclidean, internal moment are Euclidean. Okay? So that's the starting point. Now we are trying to continue the external momentum to Lorentzian series. Right? So that P0 has to come down to real axis. Okay? Normally what you do is that as P0 is coming on the real axis, right, this contour you start rotating. Right? And when they have come back down to the real axis, this contour also lies on the real axis. Okay? So you can write everything in terms of the real integral, okay, real K0 integral, except that you have to keep track of which side these poles were, right? One goes a little below, one goes a little above, and that's the I-axis prescription. Right? That's like here, for example, when you rotate the contour, this pole should be a little above, this pole should be a little below, right? That's because that preserves the side in which it was rotated. Okay, so now let's see what you can do. So you see that as these poles are of course kept fixed, nothing happens to this. But as P0 start becoming real, okay, I to E, right, like this, these poles, okay, the imaginary part starts decreasing and the real part starts increasing. Okay? Right? Imaginary part will start decreasing because P0 is becoming from imaginary to real, and the real part will start increasing because we are taking a positive P0. So this pole will move, okay, eventually this pole will come somewhere here. Sorry, this is the green one. So this pole will never affect this contour, right? It will always remain on the same side. It's never going to pass through this contour, right? Because this pole just comes down. This pole, however, is also trying to come down, okay? And at some point, this pole may reach this contour, right?
So this one will come down this way or this way?
This pole,
This one.
this will come like this.
And that will come like this or?
No, it will come like this because it's always additive. See, you can see the P0, right? The P0 is always additive, right? There's a plus minus sign over here. So as P0 real part increases, the real part of both are going to increase, and the imaginary part of both are going to decrease. Okay? So these poles are moving like this. Okay? But as this pole is moving like this, okay, if it reaches this contour, okay, you cannot let it pass through, right? Because that's not analytic continuation, right? So what can you do? You can, as it's moving, so let me draw it here. So suppose it has come here. Then what you have to do to the contour is the following. The contour has to go like this. Okay, it was going. But it cannot go straight because this pole has pushed it down. Okay. So the contour has to always remain on the right of this pole. Okay. So it has to go like this. And then return back and go like this. Okay, so this is the way you have to define your integration contour. This will be free from divergence at the two ends, right? Plus minus I infinity, because you are still going to plus minus I infinity. Okay? And you are ensuring that in the middle, okay, it gives the correct analytic continuation. Okay? So this contour integral will give the correct analytic continuation of the Euclidean amplitude. Is this point clear?
Where is it different from like in field theory?
Oh, in field theory you will do this integral like this. In
Okay. The fact that we are like
the fact that you are keeping these endpoints fixed at plus minus I infinity, that is different from conventional field theory, right? Conventionally you think of this as an integral running on the real axis, okay, and with appropriate I-axis description.
And that is this difference of the boundary condition is only due to the vortex factor, right?
Yes, because of the vortex factor, you cannot rotate.
That's the only difference between three.
That's all the difference, exactly. Right? So you could do the same even in field theory. It's that you do not, you will not work with such complicated contours in field theory, right? It's much easier to think of this as a real integral for various analyzing various properties. For example, when you are trying to calculate the imaginary part of an amplitude, right? To test unitarity. Right? It's best to choose a contour which looks as real as possible, right? So that imaginary parts are only in the I epsilon. But here you have to work with a contour like this, right? And think of this as a deformed contour in the complex state, right? You cannot think of this as a contour on the real axis.
But in field theory, one can start purely from a Lorentzian treatment, where in the Lorentzian treatment one sees the I epsilon restriction.
Yes.
That analog of, I mean, in some sense, then one can use this contour rotation to kind of show an equivalence between Euclidean and Lorentzian.
That's it, yes.
But analog of that can one do in string field theory? Or?
Well, at least not in this way, right? Because the Modic factors, as I said, are exponentially divergent, right? So we didn't try to do it in the string field theory. He wrote a paper called Feynman epsilon in string theory, right? So that in that what we try to do is to see that how to deform contour near the boundary of the complex space, right? When, for example, Z1 and Z2 are coming together, right? If you think of Z1 as an ordinary complex integral, it's divergent, right? So, or for example, when you do torus, right? You are doing integration over the tau parameter. If you think of this is an ordinary tau integral, right? It is divergent. So what you have to do is that you have to think of tau and tau bar, or Z and Z bar as independent variables, and analytically continue that integral. Okay, for Z and Z bar you deform differently. Okay? And he gave a contour prescription called the Bosch-Hammer contour, right? Where you think of Z and Z bar as independent, or tau and tau bar as independent, and you define this as a contour integral. Okay? Instead of thinking of this as a real integral over the real part of tau and imaginary part of tau. Okay? And presumably that is equivalent to this. Okay, because what you have in mind is to generalize I epsilon prescription. Okay. But the usual I epsilon, in the same way that we do in quantum field theory, is not possible in string theory. And even if there is string field theory, you are in fact doing it not in the context of string field theory, but in the context of Walsh integral, right? Where you have the integral over the analog of the swing parameter. But even if you have a string field theory, you cannot use the standard field theory contour because of this feature, that the vortices having the same feature which makes the ultraviolet properties nice, okay, also tells us that you cannot do integration over the Lorentzian body. Right? Because it's exactly the same property will now make the integral exponentially divergent. If you try to do in the
so one should just start from the Euclidean theory and then think of analytically.
Exactly, then think of analytical continuity.
Sorry, one question. I mean, suppose instead of doing this first one with the S0 integral.
Yes, that's the point. The S0 integral, the S integral.
Yes.
Yeah. So what Witten did was to see how to define the S integral. Because as you saw, the S integral, right, had a divergence, right? Because from the S going to infinity end, we have to do the analytic continuation to write it as 1 over L0 plus L0 part, right? If you think in terms of S integral, that's already divergent, right? So you have to define that.
Oh, so you are saying here if I were to first do the S integral and just write down 1 by L0 plus L0 part, then there is no vortex factor left in the K integral. That would be a wrong answer in this case, right? Because
if there is, well, there is always the vortex factor because
suppose I do the before doing the momentum integral, I first do the S integral, then this vortex factor will be gone. I'll just get the 1 by L0.
no, see, this is the S0. S integral has been done from S0 to infinity,
Right.
right? So S0 is just
after doing the integral. This is what is left.
yeah, this is what is left exactly. So I'm not even doing the S integral has been done because I have put 1 over L0 plus L0 part, right? That's what gave rise to this problem, right? This S0 is just a constant which is there in the vortex, right? And it simply is a reflection of the fact that if you have a vortex, right, and if you put external states, right, if you take arbitrary negative dimension external states, see arbitrary positive dimensions are suppressed, right? But arbitrary negative dimension external states gives a divergent endpoint function, right? And that is the divergence that we are seeing. Okay, because arbitrary negative dimension, when you scale, it picks up positive contribution, right? It picks up multiplicative contributions which are large. In fact, things get even more bizarre when you have a when P0 is larger, so let me just do that. I mean, I have drawn this here for sufficiently small P0, but imagine that P0 is sufficiently large, then the picture will be something like this. So here are the two contours, and then both of these could be on the other side of this. Okay. So the red one may come there, and the green one will come here.
So it will just go like this.
Yeah. So now the contour has to go like this. Sorry.
Around the red one, between the
Around
red and the green. But
Yeah, so between the red and the white one. So it will go.
we keep the X on the right and the red one on the left.
So
It will just go between that cross and red circle. Then go in from between red and green.
yeah, so it will go like this, I think, right? Isn't it?
No, it's,
No?
X will be to the right of this contour. So
Yeah.
it will just
So-
go around X, that means the K square plus M square port.
It will go above X, then come
Oh,
down.
yeah,
and-
yeah. That's right. Is this correct?
Yes.
This is what you will get if that thing lands upon the other side, right? By continuous deforming, you can see that this is the kind of contour you will get.
But who will decide like this value of P or
Value of P naught. P naught is the external momentum, right? That is the value at which you are trying to calculate the amplitude. Okay? And these kinds of contours have the property that they are not even invariant under reflection around the real axis, right? If you complex conjugate, these are not invariant, right? So which means that if you are trying to find the imaginary part of the amplitude, right, which is what you need for unitarity analysis, okay, you cannot use that reflection symmetry. Right? Typically, what happens is when you try to analyze unitarity properties, you have reflection symmetric contours. So most of the actual imaginary part comes from some very specific regions, right? Here it apparently looks like that it's not reflection symmetric, right? So you have to be a little more careful in dealing with unitarity. Okay. But at the end, basically everything works out, right? One can show that the amplitude that you get satisfies the usual Kaczkowski rules. Okay. But the analysis is more complicated than in a conventional field. Okay, because the prescription doesn't look manifestly real.
So here the philosophy is start from Euclidean and go to Lorentzian.
Yes, that's it.
But you made some comments about the other way around. How would it be done? If one starts from Lorentzian.
No, the amplitude is defined for Euclidean. Right? For Euclidean, there is a confusion because you can carry out this integral along the imaginary axis. See, that's what you do in conventional field theory, right? To define the Lorentzian Green's function, you start with the Euclidean Green's function and then define it as an analytic continuation. Right? And in that analytic continuation, you rotate the contour and get the I epsilon prescription. Okay. So here I am saying that you do the same thing. You start from the Euclidean prescription, Euclidean Green's function. Okay. But when you do the analytic continuation, you do the same analytic continuation in the external momentum. Okay. But the prescription for how you deal with the internal loop momentum integral is different. Okay. Then you cannot take the loop momentum integral and rotate it to lie along the real axis. Okay. Instead, you have to basically deform the contour so that you accommodate the poles. Okay, but the end points of the contour must be fixed at plus minus sign. So that's the difference, that you cannot rotate the contour to lie along the real axis. Yeah.
So there will be also integration over the K vector part, the special.
Yes, that's right.
So for that, this one for some particular value, this might overlap, right?
Yes.
Then
Yeah, so you get what happens, so those are what are called pin singularities, because those are the ones which are the causes of the imaginary source of imaginary part in the usual approach. Right? So basically they will overlap, okay, but and then they will cross each other, right? So after all, you can imagine that it was like this, right? And then it passed through this, right? But passed through this above. This red one will pass above the white one, right? Because by definition, the analytic continuation has been done from top, right? So P0 is always has a little imaginary part, positive imaginary part. Right? So the prescription is that the red one will pass on top of the white one, right? And that's what you see here. Right? If you take this and make the red one just pass on top of the white one, you will get a diagram like this. And if it had passed below, you get a different kind of diagram.
so like they never overlap on.
No, they will overlap exactly at some value of P0,
Yes,
right? Which are called the threshold singularities, right? So here, the amplitude really has genuine branch point.
Yes.
But the prescription is always that you come from above the branch point. Right? So there is branch points around the real axis, so you can say that it's ambiguous, right? Because you have to specify from which side you should come. Right? And the prescription is that you should always come from top, right? You always rotate like this to come to the positive real axis in the energy plane. You come from positive imaginary axis, and to come here, you come from there. And that is the analytic continuation procedure that is used for defining Lorentz and Green's function. And this is equivalent to I epsilon prescription. Right? Often in quantum field theory textbooks, you don't start with Euclidean and rotate. Once you give the I epsilon prescription, that's equivalent. Right? So that is telling you essentially where the poles are. Right? So in the I epsilon prescription, you will see everything. So this will always lie along the real axis. Right? But you will see some poles are a little above, some poles are a little below, right? Which is what is telling us how you should think of it. Okay, here we don't have an I epsilon, okay, but the contour itself is deformed appropriately.
But in principle, one could have tried to not come this way, but by some other.
Yeah, but that will give a different answer.
That will give a different.
Yeah, and that's the wrong answer. The point is, the physical field is defined as this.
But in the field theory, one can start from the Lorentzian theory and check that actually this is the right thing to do. But now, if purely on the Euclidean, how does one judge?
Well, the point is, what exactly would you mean by this is the right thing to do, right?
So yeah, that's exactly what I'm. So
see, this gives the correct cutting rules.
okay, so it is the cutting rules that.
Yeah, this gives the correct unitary amplitude.
Exactly.
This particular procedure.
And other one will not give.
Other one will not give the
in this
exactly. Okay. And so what I'm saying is that here the proof of the cutting rules will be more complicated, but in the same prescription, right, which gives the correct unitary amplitude here, even though it's not manifest in this complex. So the point is that the other procedure would have been that to come here, you start from a minus I and come like this, right? That will give a different analytic continuation. Right? It's a perfectly good function. Okay? Is that a different value? Right? Because and the reason is that there is a branch point sitting somewhere here, right? Which goes along the real axis. Okay? So whether you come from below or above, you get different answers. Right? And the procedure that I have used is what is conventionally used in quantum field theory. Right? Continuation from Euclidean Green's function. But I have to use exactly the same description. You start from Euclidean Green's function and to analytic continuation. It's just that the procedure by which you compute an analytically continued result is different. Right? You cannot think of this I epsilon with momentum integral running on the real axis. Right? You really have to think of the momentum integral ends tied to plus minus I. And that's the only difference. But if somebody tells you that okay, this is your Euclidean Green's function and you define the Lorentzian one by analytic continuation, that statement is the same for field theory and string theory.
And I guess it was the criterion is right cutting rules at the end.
Exactly. At the end, you have to get the right cutting tools. Yeah. Okay, so now I'll try to do some examples.
So in the Lorentzian case, K0 runs from minus infinity to plus infinity, right?
That's it, yes.
So why are you not continuing K0, the fixed points of the contour? The end points of the contour?
Endpoints are minus I infinity to plus I infinity.
Yeah.
The reason that you are not continuing it is because if K0 goes to plus infinity or minus infinity, okay, the integral is exponential divergent. Because the vortex factors, as we discussed, right, have exponential of plus K0 square, right? Because K0 square, in the K square expression, K0 square is on minus K0 square, right? So if it is exponential of plus K0 square, then an integral like this will be ill-defined, right? It's an exponential divergent integral that we are trying to integrate. Okay? That's the reason why you fix that. In this case, you don't let the end points move,
The poles.
but let the contour move in the intermediate region so that it adjusts itself to our poles. Right? In the conventional formulation, you make the end point. Okay? See, you could have, even in the conventional formulation, you could have used some prescriptions of this kind. Right? Nobody tells you that the end point has to move. You could have kept the end point fixed at plus minus I infinity. Isn't it will make the analysis of various amplitudes a little more complicated. Okay? So that freedom is there in the conventional amplitude that you can rotate and bring it here, and you can say that you basically ignore the integral from infinity. Right? As long as the integral is sufficiently falling off sufficiently fast at infinity, you can always rotate the contour from here to here without picking up any contribution. That argument breaks down for straight line, that you cannot rotate from here to here.
Well, then will it be wrong if I just say that okay, I will give a very small imaginary part to it and then take it to infinity?
Very small imaginary part.
I mean,
No, that's not enough. That is not enough because you have to make sure that K square is positive. Right? If K0 has a very small imaginary part and a very large real part, that will not help. Right? A very small imaginary part, a very large real part will give you a K0 square, right? With a positive coefficient. Adding a small imaginary part will give some I K0, some oscillatory part, right? It's not going to help overcoming the exponential K0 square term. So you really cannot go very far. You can move a little bit. You can change the angle. Okay, a little bit, but not like this. Okay, in fact, the ability to change the angle is necessary for Lorentz invariance. Right? Because I mean, you can start with a K which is Euclidean. Right? K0 is I times something and K is real. K vector is real, and you make a Lorentz transformation. Okay? Then of course the K0 doesn't remain purely imaginary, right? Okay, nevertheless you will expect that the result should be unchanged, and so the point is that you don't have to go really along this axis. You have some freedom. Okay, you can go at different angles.
Real part will be small.
Yeah, real part is sufficiently small, right? And that is guaranteed because of the property of Lorentz transformation, right? If you start with ik0 and k vector, right? And if ik0 is very large, then you can say no amount of Lorentz transformation, you can make k square go from positive to negative or negative to positive.
If you keep the asymptotics of the contour fixed,
Yes.
then any deformation of the contour which avoids that red pole is fine, right? Or no?
Well, no, you have to say which direction. I mean, you could have taken this to a positive imaginary axis, right?
No, I take it like this. Asymptotically, it goes along.
But yeah, but the point is, if you take the contour like this, suppose you take the contour like this,
yeah.
and the red poles are like this. There is a red pole here. This is not the correct contour.
No, I am not taking that. I am
Yeah.
taking asymptotically the contour going this thing. But you did one deformation. There is another deformation possible, right?
But which are related to each other by continuous deformation, right? So I did this deformation by simply starting from the original configuration, right? and then following what is happening as P0 is coming down to I, right? So that's the contour you have to use. Right? Otherwise, this contour also avoids all the poles. Right? This contour is not good enough because this is not a deformation of the original contour.
Okay, no. I have to have a contour which is on the right of the red pole. Right?
Yes, but for example, this contour is also not good enough. There is a
There is another one water from below and goes the
yeah.
That's
So-
also not good enough because of the deformation.
Yeah, so suppose this is, let's write this.
Yeah. Now if you go below all of them.
Yeah, so you have to keep the right pole to the right,
Yeah.
okay,
So you-
and this one to the sorry, this one to the right. This one to the right, and this is to the left, right?
Yes.
Okay. So you could have made a contour like this.
Like that.
In fact, it turns out that when you do a unitary analysis, right, this is the contour that is relevant for computing the complex conjugate of the ordinal. Okay, and the fact that this is different from this, right, the difference is precisely the right hand side of the unitary relation.
This is the reflection symmetry that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. So if you make a reflection symmetry, if you make a reflection, right, you get to this contour.
Yes.
Which is, well, it doesn't look like this, but you can make a reflection and then you can show that by deformation you will get here. Okay. The fact that these two contours are different, right, is the reason why T and T dagger are not the same. Right? The T minus T dagger has some contribution on the right hand side. So the proof of cutting relation here involves basically keeping track of what happens when you deform from here to here. Right? What kind of residues you pick up. Okay, and that's what contributes to the right hand side of the unitary relation.
So if the red pole could go through some negative imaginary value, then this could have been possible.
Exactly, but that's precisely the point. That if you had done this, defined this by analytic continuation from this side, right? Then you would have arrived here. Okay, but by definition, you have to analytic continuation from the positive side, or from the positive imaginary side. Right? And that's why it's this contour which is relevant for the original amplitude. This is the one which is relevant for the complex conjugate amplitude. Okay, so as I said, now we'll come back to string theory and some examples. So we defined last time A1, A2, A3 as F1 dot A1 0, F2 dot A2 0, F3 dot A3 0. And we also said that if necessary, you can average over different classes. So let's try to look for some specific choice for F1, F2, F3 which satisfy all the right requirements. Okay, like by symmetries and so on. And we look for F1, F2, F3 which are all SL2C transformations, which are all related to the global coordinate on the sphere by SL2C transformation. This is not necessary, okay, and as I have already emphasized that the standard formulation of string field theory does not use SL2C transformation, it uses a more complicated version. But we will proceed with SL2C and see what we can get. So let's suppose that Z is the global coordinate of the sphere. And W1, W2, W3 are local coordinates at punctures. And the relationship is Z is F1 W1, Z is F2 W2, and Z is F3 W3. Okay, this is the way the global and local coordinates are related. Now we'll also choose, okay, this is a choice, but this can always be ensured by SL2C transformation. That F10 is 0, F20 is 1, and F30 is infinity. Okay, any 3 points on the sphere can always be brought to 0, 1 and infinity by an SL2C transformation on the set. Okay, so let's suppose that we have done that. Now you have to choose F1, F2 and F3 satisfy the desired properties. Okay, what those properties are we will come to in a few minutes. So let's now try. Let's try. F1 of W1 as lambda W1. Okay, lambda is a parameter, small parameter that you have introduced. Okay, lambda is a fixed number which you can adjust. Okay, so this is the simplest thing that you can think of. Right? So the simplest would have been W1, but we are just scaling by this lambda, so that we can take set lambda equal to 1 and then into 1, but we give this freedom. Given this, if we want symmetric vortex, the choice of F2 and F3 are no longer arbitrary. Okay, and we will now see how they get fixed. So to find F2 and F3, we have to first look for an SL2C transformation. Look for SL2C transformation G of Z, okay, which I'll actually say AZ plus B over CZ plus B, such that G of 0 is 1, G of 1 is infinity, and G of infinity is 0. Why have we done that? Because this SL2C transformation takes the first point to the second point to the third point, and third point to the first point, right? So G of F10 is F2 of 0, G of F2 of 0 is F3 of 0, and G of F3 of 0 is F1 of 0. Okay? So this is by choice. I have chosen G this way. But then for symmetry, we have to ensure that G of F1 of Z is F2 of Z, G of F2 of Z is F3 of Z, and G of F3 of Z is F1 of Z. Right? That's the cyclic symmetry, right? Which is part of the permutation group. It's not all, but it is certainly necessary.
That's why F2 and F3 cannot be arbitrary functions.
That's why F2 and F3 cannot be arbitrary, right? We can fix F2 and F3 from this data.
Okay, I'm a bit lost. Can you repeat why did you write this F1 of omega 1 is equal to W1?
This choice, I'm just choosing, right? F1 of 0 is 0, right? So I have to choose some F1, right? And I am restricting myself to SL2C transformation. Okay, again that's a choice. Right? So this is the simplest thing that one can think of.
Yeah.
Right? So this is my choice, but you can try other, so make other choices, right? You may get different vortices, okay, with other choices. But let's just see what happens, how much can we get by choosing this to be lambda. So let's first fix G. Okay, so G of 0 equal to 1 tells us that A over C plus D, G over D, this gives you B over D equal to 1, this gives you C plus D equal to 0, right? Because G of 1 has to be 0, so has to be infinity, so the denominator must become 0, and G of infinity is 0, which basically means A over C must be 0. Okay, so this tells us that D is D, A is 0, and C is minus D.
So if we just make A equals to 0, then also this works. Z in the denominator. So put infinity.
If you make, so G of 1 has to be infinity, right?
No, for the third case, you said A over C equals to 0. That will essentially mean A equals to 0.
Yeah, that's the essentially A equal to 0, exactly. Yeah. Okay, that's how it can be. So B equal to B, A equal to 0, C equal to B. Right? So if you put it back, then G of Z becomes B is D, so D actually cancels, so 1 over 1 minus z. Is this clear? So now let's look at the consequence of cyclic symmetry. So G of F1 of 0 is F2 of 0. That's my construct, right? That's how we have chosen our G. But for cyclic symmetry of the vortex, we need that G of F1 is F2 as a function, not just divided by 0. Right? So cyclic symmetry will require that F2 of W should be G of F1 of W, which is 1 over 1 minus lambda. Is this clear? Right? F2 of 0 is 1, as you can see, which is as it should be. F3 of W should be G of F2 of W. So this is 1 over 1 minus 1 over 1 minus lambda W. So this is 1 minus lambda W over minus lambda W. So 1 minus 1 over lambda W. Is this okay? 1 minus lambda W comes up and the numerator of the minus lambda W. And finally, you have to check that G of F3 of W is equal to F1 of W. This is true. I'll leave it an exercise to check this. Which is not very surprising because G is actually a transform to its cube is identity. Right? If I apply G 3 times, then you will find that Z comes back to Z, so it's not surprising that because you have defined F2 as G of F1, F3 as G of F2, right? G of F3 will be given as well.
And for this to work for any G, this has to be true, that cube has to be, because
Yes, that's because G is supposed to do this, right?
Yes.
That G of 0 is 1, G of 1 is infinity, and G of infinity is equal to 0. So cube of G has to be
And
identical.
also functionally also probably.
Yeah, but this is functionally true because the point is once you know that 0 goes to 1, 1 goes to infinity, and infinity goes to 0, because SL2C
Yeah.
fixes that completely, right?
Yes.
So there is no other possible function. So if G has this property, any function that has any SL2C transform that has the property that it takes 0 to 1, 1 to infinity, and infinity to 0, right? Its cube, right, keeps fixed 0, 1, and infinity, right? And hence it must be identity as a function.
This SL2C gives between any 3 points if it ponders.
Yeah, take 3 fixed points, right? And suppose it has a property that it cyclically ponders those 3 points. Then cube of that will fix all the 3 points,
Yes, yes, yes.
right? And any SL2C transformation that fixes all the 3 points is identity,
Yes, yes.
right? This is a general result, right? So as a function it has to be identity. Okay, so far so good, right? We have found F1, F2, F3, and this vortex with this choice has cyclic symmetry. But now we have to check for exchange. So exchange so find h of z such that h of 0 is 1, h of 1 is 0, and h of infinity is infinity. Again, SL2C transformation. H belongs to SL2C. Why are you doing this? Because you also want to check that the remaining element of the permutation group, which corresponds to exchanging 1 and 2 keeping 3 fixed, that also leaves the vertex invariant. Right? Because the permutation group is arbitrary permutation of the 6 of the sphere objects. So what is such an H? Well, you can again go through this exercise like this, but you can actually guess what it is. H of Z is 1 minus Z. It takes Z 0 to 1, 1 to 0, and infinity to infinity. Right? If Z is equal to infinity, it remains infinity. So what do we need? H dot F1 should be F2. H dot F2 should be F1, and H dot F3 should be F3. So is this true? Let's check. H dot F1 W is 1 minus F1 W, right? So H of Z is 1 minus Z.
Sir, is this SL2Z? Because AD minus BC doesn't.
It should be Z minus 1.
No, AD minus BC you can always multiply by minus 1, right? Why isn't it SN2C?
No, here H infinity is minus infinity.
Yes, it's H infinity minus.
Well, minus infinity and plus infinity are the same.
Oh, yeah. This
Because the point at infinity is identical, right? See, the SL2C point at infinity is identical. You are worried about it, you can write it as SL2C transformation?
Yeah.
Because it's 1 minus Z over 0 plus 1
Minus 1.
AZ plus B. Okay, so you are writing minus Z plus 1 by 0 plus 1. Is that what you are worried? 0 times Z plus 1. Is that, so the determinant is minus 1.
Yeah. That's what
Well, that's easy to read. This is multiplied by I. So it's transformation is the same. Okay, you have to just it does this. So for SL2 there is a confusion. Okay, for SL2C there is a confusion because you can always multiply by I. So this is SL2C. It's not SL2 also. That because the determinant is minus 1. Right? In SL2 you cannot do this. Okay, so H of F1W is 1 minus F1W. But F1W is this. Where is F1W? Lambda W1. 1 minus lambda W, right? Well, it doesn't look like F2. Right? It's 1 over 1 minus lambda W, so it's not F2. So what do? We call this F2 tilde. H dot F2 W is 1 minus F2 W, and that is 1 over lambda W. We call this F1 tilde. And H dot F3 W is 1 minus F3 W, which is, sorry, I think H dot F2 I made a mistake, right? It is 1 minus this.
Yeah, lambda to be upon 1 minus lambda to be.
Yeah, so, or minus lambda W over 1 minus lambda W, which is minus lambda W over 1 minus lambda W, right? Which I am calling it quantity now. This is 1 minus 1 over lambda W. But this is 1 over lambda W because if Q was 1 minus 1 over lambda W. I call this F3 tilde. Okay, just F2 tilde, F1 tilde, and F tilde this way. Okay, why? It will become clear in a minute. So now I'll change the definition. Half of this plus okay, this is what I call averaging over sections. Okay, two different choices, F1, F2, F3 and F1 tilde, F2 tilde, F3 tilde. We average. Now under exchange, these become this. Right, under 1 to exchange. Okay, because F1 becomes F2 tilde, F2 becomes F1 tilde. Pardon?
F1 becomes F2 tilde.
Either AI or F.
Should be dot 1
If 3 tilde, I think should be F1 tilde.
No, this is okay probably. Because see, under A1 A2 exchange, right? What will happen under A1 A2 exchange? This will become F1 dot A2, F2 dot A1, right?
Oh, under exchange. you are-
Under exchange of A1 and A2, this will become F1 dot A2, F2 dot A1. Okay. Now we apply that H transformation, right? That H transformation will make this into F2 tilde dot A2 and F1 tilde dot A1, right? Which is this one. This is clear? We have to also do a little more work, okay, to make sure this is again cyclical symmetric. See, this was cyclical symmetric, right? But now this one, okay, should also have the property that G of F1 tilde is F2 tilde, G of F2 tilde is F3 tilde, and G of F3 tilde is F1 tilde. And this you can easily check this row. Okay, so this is individual, this is cyclical symmetric, this is cyclical symmetric. And under exchange of A1 and A2, this becomes this. Okay, let's do a little bit on the 4-point function.
So this will make sure that under A2 and A3 exchange also it will be.
Under?
A2.
Yes, you can show that under F2 and F3 exchange also this works. Okay. Basically, it follows from the fact that you combine the cyclic symmetry and the exchange, right, and you can get the other exchange. Yeah, so one can check. I will leave it as an exercise. I have not done the full analysis exercise. Check full symmetry. Okay, under any exchange, any cyclic perturbation, this thing is invariant. Okay, either they are individually invariant or they get exchanged. As I said, this is not needed. Okay, there are vortices which does it only one choice of F1, F2 and F3, but those are not essential to see transformations. Those are more complicated transformations. Now let's see how to construct a 4-point function. Okay, and I'll consider a standard diagram. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, there will be 4 terms. You can either do the FFF with FFF. See, there are 2 vortices, right? Here there is FFF term and then F tilde, F tilde, F tilde, and so is there. Then I can have FFF with F tilde, F tilde, F tilde, or other way. Or this. Okay, I'll just illustrate this for this. how to.
Why 2 and 3 will be different?
Because one is FFF on this side, F tilde on that side. The other one is F tilde on this side and FFF on that side. Okay? They will be different in the sense they will be related to exchange of 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay? These are marked points, right? They are different orders of parts being inserted at these different external states, right? So exchange is in general different. Okay, so let's put some states over here. Okay, let me call this A, B, C, D. Okay, these are the external states that we are going to put. And we have to make a choice of which puncture you glue. Right? Because on this side there are 3 punctures. On this side there are 3 punctures. Because our vortex is completely symmetric, the final result doesn't depend on which puncture you choose to glue. Right? Because you can shift the punctures around by SMC transformation. Okay? So we'll make a convention that we'll glue the first puncture of the first surface with the first puncture of the second surface. Okay, it's nice because the puncture is at W equal to is at Z equal to 0. Right? So the gluing relation will be a little simple. Okay, glue first puncture of this with first puncture of that. Okay. So you glue by, so we say W1, 1, W1, 2, and W1, 3 are the local coordinates of first and W21, W22, W23 are local coordinates of second sphere. And the gluing relation then is W1, W21 is equal to Q. Okay, which is equal to minus S plus minus S. So what is our goal? On the glued surface, we now want to introduce a global coordinate, tan of the Z, it's less sphere, right? So you can cover with a single Z. Okay. And then you want to relate the local coordinates around these punctures to Z. Right? That will tell you the optional 4-point function. Okay. So we have to first make a choice of what coordinate we are going to use as the global coordinate on the glued sphere. Okay. And we'll choose, so we denote by Z1 the global coordinate on the first sphere on first sphere, Z2 as the global coordinate of the second sphere, and we'll choose Z1 as the global coordinate of the glued sphere. Purely matter of convention. Okay, you could have used Z2 or anything else. Okay, but I'll choose Z1 as the global coordinate of the sphere after doing. Is this clear? The local coordinates are the punctures. Punctures. So at A is W12, at B is W13, at C is W22, and D is W23. W11 and W21 have been glued. Okay, so those punctures are gone. So the local coordinates at A is the W12, the second puncture of the first sphere. B is inserted at the third puncture of the first sphere. So W13. C is at the second puncture of the second sphere. D is at the third puncture of the second sphere. Right? So these are the local coordinates. Is this clear?
Just Z1 of using it as a global, I mean, it is, I mean, it's probably, I mean, you can, because the functional relationships that will relate things to W2, those will not be obvious, like how W2 will be.
Yeah, we'll relate. We'll see how exactly it's done. Okay? Here it's simple because everything is SN2C. Okay? That's why you can extend Z1. So typically, if it's not SN2C trace, which is single value on the whole thing. Here, because all the Green functions are SN2C, it's very easy. You can declare, you can take any coordinate, right? Whether it's Z1, W, I mean, any of the local coordinates you can take as a global coordinate. Because all of these are related by SN2C transformation, right?
So that's why you chose the ifs to be global.
Exactly. That's why I chose the X to be SN2C. Okay, because for illustration this is much simpler. Now, the problem is I have raised F1, F2, F3, so let me try to read them off from the notes.
F1 was lambda 1.
So F1 of W was lambda W, right?
Yes.
F2 of W
1 minus 1 by 1.
was what?
It's 1 by 1 minus
1 by 1 minus lambda W. And F3 of W was
1 minus 1 minus.
So let's relate first Z1 to the local coordinate at E. This is what you are supposed to do, right? Because you are supposed to take a global coordinate and see how it's related to local coordinates at the various punctures, right? Z1 to local coordinate of A. That's very easy. Z1 was F2 of W2 to W1. Okay, so that's 1 over 1 minus lambda W12, which I'll declare as F1 of W1. Okay, this is the first function that relates the local coordinate of puncture A to Z1. Okay, the capital F's are the relationship between the global and local coordinates in the glued surface. Okay, then you have Z1 is equal to F3 of W13, which is 1 minus 1 over lambda W13. These are called F2 of W13. Okay, F1 and F2 are very easy to find because we are using the same global coordinate as the original sphere. Now, we also know that Z2 is F2 of W2 2. Okay? Okay, so relationship between the Z2 and W2 is irrelevant. But what you want is the relationship between Z1 and W2, right? Because Z1 is a global coordinate. Okay? So to find somehow the relationship between Z1 and Z2. Okay? And that is done by this gluing relation. Okay? So Z1 is lambda W11. Z2 is lambda W21. So you see that Z1 Z2 is lambda square times this product, but that's true. So from this we get the Z1 is lambda square q by Z2, which is from here lambda square q times 1 minus lambda W22. This I call F3 of W22. And finally, Z2 is F3 of W23, which is 1 minus 1 over lambda W23. So Z1 is lambda square q by Z2, which is lambda square lambda cube W23 over lambda W23. And this one should be F4. Is this clear? So on the glued surface, we have now determined how the local coordinates and the punctures, and these 4 punctures, where A, B, C and D are inserted in terms of the global coordinates Z1. So this now defines the amplitude, the 4-point amplitude on the glued surface. Okay, it also tells us precisely which part of the moduli space it's covering, right? So let's work that out and then I'll stop. So locations. Okay, because this is what we needed to find out why the moduli space. So A, where is A? A is at F1 of 0. Right? F1 of 0 is at 1. B is at F2 of 0. F2 of 0 is at infinity. Yeah? Which is not a surprise because in the Z1, the original sphere had the punctures located at 1 and infinity. Right? The 0, 1 was removed. So this is at infinity. Is F3 of 0. F3 of 0 is lambda square times 2. And B is F4 of 0. F4 of 0 is 0. Yeah, so now you see the lambda is fixed but q is variable, right? Q is equal to minus s plus I theta. Q is equal to minus s plus I theta. S minus I theta. So as you vary q, what you have is a 4-punctured sphere. A, B and D are inserted at fixed points. 1, infinity and 0. And the location of C is varied. And you can work out precisely what region of the moduli space it covers. Right? Location of C, we have mod q less than 1. Okay, so given that these are fixed at 1, infinity and 0, mod f3 is less than mod lambda square. That's the region it covers. Yeah. So let me draw this plane. So in the Z1 plane now we have one D is at 0, right? C is at lambda square q. So C I'll draw later. A is at 1 B is at infinity. Okay, and C is varying. Right? Now the question is which part of the region, which part of the moduli space does C cover?
Oh,
Using the fact that mod Q is less than or equal to 1, we see that the mode of F3 of 0 is less than or equal to lambda square. Okay? So in this plane, then it covers a region of radius mod lambda square. Okay? This is the region that is covered by the integration over 2. Is it clear? Then you can see that it includes the region on D. Right? The degeneration where the C and D are close is included in this region fully. Right? And that's what it's supposed to do. Right? The degeneration region should be included in these kinds of diagrams, the S channel diagram. So similarly, how to do T channel, right? One simple way to do T channel is to, so in T channel,
Sorry, here what? Here it automatically forces A and B to come together because it's full.
no, not forces. A is here, B is there, right? D is here, C is moving around in this region, right? So the integration over Q covers the part of the moduli space where C lies anywhere in this space, right? Which includes the region where C is close to D, right?
But in the diagram, we also had OP of AB, right, which is connecting. I mean, is that force?
Well, this is conformally, putting these two together is the same as putting these two together, right?
This automatic.
It's automatic, it's conformally equivalent, right?
Because
Because
3-point function.
it's a 3-point function, exactly. So once you put these two together, you can also make a conformal transformation to reinterpret this as A and B coming together. Right? So it doesn't look symmetric, it looks like C is varying, right? A and B are fixed, but that's just, you can undo it by SLC. Is this clear? Okay. Now, to get the T channel, okay, what we can do is to see T channel, C comes close to A, right? So you just extend A and B. Right? In the, that's the simplest way to find which region it covers. Just extend A and B. Okay? So these are called now A and these are called B. Okay? But it's more convenient to think of A, B and D fixed in all the diagrams. Okay? So what you can do is, okay, it's true that A and D get exchanged, right? But then you can make an SL2C transformation to put them back in the original places. Okay? But in that process, you will cover a disk around A. Right? When C comes near A. Is this clear? Okay? So what I am saying is that you can do the thing from the scratch again, right? But you don't have to do it. What you can do is you take this diagram, just exchange A and B. Okay? Put A here, B here. And then make an SL2C transformation that extends A and B. Okay? Keeping B fixed. That's the same, Z goes to 1 minus Z. Right? Z goes to 1 minus Z into the job because 1 is at 0, 1 is at 1. Okay? But the result is that this disk, which was initially around the point 0, will now come around the point 1. Okay? You will get a disk of radius mod lambda square around 1.
So from here we will get the relation how that will be.
Well, you can work out from there. But all I am saying is that you don't have to work out from there. Right? Just extend A and D in the diagram. So if you look at this diagram, which you calculated, right? We calculated A, B, C, D. Right? All I am saying is that if we exchange A and C, you want to keep fixed. So if you exchange A and B, right? Then all you have to do is that in this diagram, you keep the same picture, but the vertex operator, which was A here, is now D, and the vertex operator inside here will be A. The functions are exactly the same. Now we make an SL2C transformation of this diagram. okay, which takes the point 0 to 1, 1 to 0, keeping infinity fixed. Okay, all the relationship between the z's and the w's get transformed accordingly. And this disk, which was around the origin, now gets shifted here. Yeah, and the z goes to 1 minus z. Okay. So T channel diagram will cover a disk around the point here, around this point. And similarly, the U channel diagram will cover a disk around B. Okay, which is basically, you will find that the U channel diagram after you do this, will cover some disk like this. Okay, disk around here.
How large lambda can be?
Well, you can, it's completely up to you, right? If you don't want them to overlap, right, you should make sure that these disks, the disk around this and the disk around this and this disk do not overlap. Okay? So in this language, you can say that mod lambda square can be taken up to half. If you take mod lambda square up to half, right, that's a disk of radius half. Right? Disk of radius half fits in because it goes up to half and from 1 also it comes up to half. Okay, so up to mod lambda square equal to half, you can ensure that the disks don't overlap.
And this is that when you are saying, even if they overlap, there will be a SL2C so that I can.
No, there will no, you have to subtract. See, if they overlap, right, that means the same region of the moduli space is covered more than once, so you have to just subtract it. In the difference of the 4-point function, you have to subtract it.
And someone commented that I can take some limit where they don't overlap.
Yeah, so that's the limit of small lambda.
Sorry.
Right? If lambda is sufficiently small, then there is a disk of small radius here, this disk of small radius over here. Then they will never overlap. Right? And this will be a disk of a large radius because this is around infinity, right? So small radius here will go over to large radius. Yeah.
So this transformation that f4 0 is equal to 0, it means that the point D is at z1 equal to 0.
That's it, exactly.
But our one of the punctures was originally at z1 equal to 0, right?
But that has been proved. See that? What we have done is that we have so in the z plane, right? There is a puncture around z1 equal to 0. So we remove this disk. Right? There are punctures at 1 and infinity, right? Which we kept. Then we glued the other disk inside, right? The whole of the other sphere has gone inside this disk now, right? And it just so happens that one of the punctures from S2 has followed exactly the origin. Right? Where this puncture came from not S1 but S2. Right? Because the S2 is being glued in the interior of this, right? It could happen that one of the punctures have followed exactly the origin. And that's what has happened here. Okay, so I think I'll stop here. So next 2 weeks there will be no lectures, again we will start 2 weeks from now.